In the beginning, before kingdoms and empires, before the rise and fall of men, there was a story written not on parchment, but in the very soul of humanity. It is the story of faith and failure, of promise and redemption, a story older than the stones of Jerusalem, yet alive in every generation. The Old Testament is not merely a record of ancient events, it is a tapestry of divine encounters, epic journeys, and the fragile hearts of men and women who walked with God, from the dawn of creation to the rise of kings, from exile in foreign lands to the hope of return. These timeless stories echo with lessons that still speak to us today. They tell us of a God who forms light out of darkness, who calls nations from nothing, who delivers his people with a mighty hand, and who whispers his covenant into the hearts of those willing to listen. This is more than history. It is a mirror of the human soul, showing our struggles with faith, our tendency to wander, and the endless grace of the one who calls us back. Join us as we step into the ancient world, into deserts and palaces, into battles and prayers, and witness the unfolding drama of God and his people. These are the timeless stories of the Old Testament. Creation of the world and humanity. In the beginning, there was nothing. No earth, no sky, no light. The universe lay in silence, covered in darkness and void. And then, a voice broke through eternity. God spoke, "Let there be light." And light appeared. Radiant and pure, it pierced the void. God separated the light from the darkness, calling the light day and the darkness night. This was the first day of creation. On the second day, God stretched out the heavens. He created a great expanse to divide the waters, separating those below from those above. And so the sky was born, an endless canopy between the seas and the clouds. On the third day, God gathered the waters under heaven into one place, and dry land appeared. He called the dry ground earth, and the gathered waters seas. But he did not stop there. He commanded the earth to bring forth life, grass and herbs that yield seed, trees bearing fruit, each according to its kind. The barren land bloomed with green, and creation began to breathe. On the fourth day, God gave the world its lights. Two great lights to govern time itself, the greater light the sun to rule the day, and the lesser light the moon to rule the night. He also placed the stars in the heavens, countless in number, shining as eternal witnesses to the order of creation. On the fifth day, God filled the waters and skies with life. He commanded the seas to swarm with creatures, great and small. Whales and fish of every kind swam in the deep, while the skies filled with the beating wings of birds. The world echoed with the sounds of creation songs, splashes, and the flutter of wings. On the sixth day, God created living creatures on the land, the wild beasts of the forest, the herds of livestock, and every creeping thing that moved upon the ground. And then, the most profound act of all, God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." And he formed humanity, male and female, giving them dominion over the earth, the seas, and the skies. He blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it." Humanity was to be both steward and heir of creation. At last came the seventh day. The work was finished. God looked upon all that he had made, and it was good. On this day, he rested, blessing and sanctifying it, making it holy as the eternal symbol of completion. Thus, from nothingness came light, life, and the human soul born in the image of the divine, standing at the center of creation. The fall of man in the heart of Eden, the garden of perfect beauty. God placed Adam and Eve. Their task was simple: to live in harmony with creation and care for the garden. Every tree was theirs to enjoy except one. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil stood at the center, and God warned them, "If you eat from it, you shall surely die." But into this paradise crept a cunning serpent, subtle, deceptive, more crafty than any creature the Lord had made. He approached Eve with a question that carried a hidden sting. "Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden?" Eve answered, "We may eat fruit from the trees, but God commanded us not to eat or even touch the fruit of the tree in the middle of the garden. If we do, "We will die," the serpent whispered back, weaving doubt into her heart. "You will not surely die. God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like gods, knowing good and evil." Eve looked upon the fruit. It was pleasing to the eye, rich with promise, and seemed to offer wisdom. She reached out, took it, and ate. Then she gave it to Adam, who was with her, and he too ate. In that moment, their eyes were opened and they realized they were naked. Shame washed over them. Hastily, they sewed fig leaves together to cover themselves. As evening fell, they heard the sound of the Lord walking in the garden. Fear struck them, and they hid among the trees. But God called out, "Adam, where are you?" Adam replied, trembling, "I heard you in the garden, and I was afraid, because I was naked. So I hid." God asked, "Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree I commanded you not to eat?" Adam shifted the blame. "The woman you gave me, she gave me the fruit, and I ate." God turned to Eve. "What is this you have done?" She answered, "The serpent deceived me, and I ate." And so God pronounced judgment. The serpent was cursed to crawl on its belly and eat dust all its days. Enmity would forever remain between the serpent and the offspring of the woman. To Eve, God said, "I will greatly increase your pain in childbirth. You will desire your husband, and he will rule over you." To Adam, he said, "Because you listened to your wife and ate from the tree, the ground is cursed because of you. By the sweat of your brow you will toil all your days. Thorns and thistles will it bring forth, and you will eat bread until you return to the dust, for dust you are, and to dust you shall return." Yet even in judgment, there was mercy. God made garments of skin for Adam and Eve, clothing their shame. But then he spoke, "The man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. He must not be allowed to reach out his hand and take from the tree of life, and live forever." So God expelled them from Eden. At its gates, he placed cherubim and a flaming sword, turning in every direction, guarding the way to the tree of life. Thus ended the perfect innocence of Eden. And thus began humanity's journey through struggle, labor, and longing for redemption. Cain and Abel. After Adam and Eve were cast out of Eden, they began their life in the world beyond the garden. In time, they had two sons, Cain, the firstborn, who became a farmer and tilled the soil, and Abel, his younger brother, who became a shepherd and cared for flocks of sheep. One day, both brothers brought offerings to God. Cain presented the fruits of the land he had harvested, while Abel chose the firstborn and finest of his lambs. God looked with favor upon Abel's sacrifice, but he did not accept Cain's offering. Cain was crushed. His heart burned with anger and jealousy. He could not understand why his gift was rejected while Abel's was received. Resentment grew into envy, and envy into rage. God, seeing Cain's turmoil, spoke to him with warning. "Why are you angry? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must master it." But Cain did not master it. He let the bitterness take root. One day, he lured Abel into the fields under the guise of conversation. There, overcome with wrath, he struck down his brother, committing the first murder in human history. Later, God called to Cain, "Where is Abel, your brother?" Cain replied defiantly, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" But God said, "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you are cursed from the very earth, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood. You shall be a restless wanderer upon the earth." Fear gripped Cain, and he protested, "My punishment is greater than I can bear. Whoever finds me will kill me." Yet God showed mercy even in judgment. He placed a mark upon Cain, a sign that no one should kill him. "If anyone harms Cain, vengeance shall be taken sevenfold." And so Cain went out from the presence of the Lord, and dwelt in the land of Nod, east of Eden. There he built a city, and named it after his son, Enoch. This tragic story of Cain and Abel is not only the tale of the first brothers, but also the first shadow of violence in human history, a warning of how envy and anger can destroy. And how even in judgment, God's hand still shows restraint and care. Later, Adam and Eve bore another son, Seth, through whom the line of humanity would continue, carrying forward the story of mankind beyond Eden's gates. Noah and the flood. From the line of Adam's descendants came many generations, but among them rose one man set apart, Noah, in a world steeped in violence and corruption. Noah alone remained righteous, a man who walked faithfully with God. Seeing the wickedness of humanity, God resolved to cleanse the earth. He revealed his plan to Noah and gave him a task both strange and monumental: to build an ark. God gave exact instructions: the size, the wood, the rooms, and the coverings, so that it would be large enough to shelter Noah, his family, and a pair of every living creature upon the earth. Though people mocked him, laughing at the idea of a coming flood when no storm clouds darkened the skies, Noah obeyed. With steady hands and unwavering faith, he built the ark as God commanded. When the work was complete, God called Noah, his wife, his sons, and their wives into the ark. Then he sent to them pairs of animals, mighty elephants and small sparrows, roaring lions and gentle lambs. Once all were inside, God himself shut the door, and the rains began. For 40 days and 40 nights, the heavens opened. Waters surged from the depths below and poured from the skies above until the earth was swallowed in flood. The highest mountains vanished beneath the waves, and all living things outside the ark perished. Only Noah, his family, and the creatures aboard remained safe, adrift on the endless waters. After many days, the storm ceased, and the waters began to recede. Noah released a raven, which flew back and forth. Then he sent out a dove. The first time, it returned with nothing. The second time, it carried an olive branch in its beak, a sign that life had returned to the earth. The third time, the dove did not come back, and Noah knew the land was ready. When the ground was dry, God commanded Noah to leave the ark. With his family and all the animals, Noah stepped onto a cleansed earth. The first thing he did was build an altar, offering sacrifices of thanksgiving. God blessed Noah and made a covenant with him: never again would a flood destroy all life on earth. As a sign of this everlasting promise, God placed a rainbow in the sky. Whenever the rainbow appears in the clouds, he said, "It will remind you of my covenant with all living creatures." Thus, Noah and his descendants began a new life, and through his obedience, the world received both a new beginning and a symbol of eternal hope. The Tower of Babel. After the great flood and the salvation of Noah, humanity once again began to multiply and spread across the earth. At that time, all people spoke a single language. They understood one another perfectly, united not only by speech, but also by ambition. As they journeyed eastward, they settled on the plain of Shinar. There, with a bold vision, they decided to build a great city with a tower that would reach to the heavens. They said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly." And so they used bricks instead of stone, and tar for mortar. Their dream was not only practical but symbolic. The people longed to create a monument to their own greatness, a tower that would declare their power and prevent them from being scattered across the earth. "Let us build a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves," they proclaimed. But God looked upon their work and saw the pride rising in their hearts. Humanity, united by one tongue and one purpose, sought to exalt themselves rather than honor their Creator. God said, "Behold, they are one people, and they all have one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do. Nothing they propose will be impossible for them." So God chose to intervene. He came down and confused their language, so they could no longer understand one another. Chaos erupted at the construction site. Where once there had been unity, now there was confusion. One worker gave instructions, but his neighbor heard only strange sounds. The tower stood unfinished, abandoned and disordered. From that place, God scattered people across the face of the earth, each group carrying with it a new tongue and culture. The city became known as Babel, meaning confusion, for their God confused the language of all humanity. The story of the Tower of Babel reminds us of the danger of pride and the limits of human ambition when it turns away from God. Yet it also explains the great diversity of languages and cultures in the world today, a scattering that, though born of judgment, also gave rise to the richness of nations and peoples. From that scattering, history moved toward a new chapter, as God began to choose individuals and families like Abraham through whom his plan for humanity would continue to unfold. God and Abraham. Among the many descendants of Noah was a man chosen for a special purpose, Abraham. He came from the line of Shem and lived in the ancient city of Ur, known for his righteousness and faithfulness. Abraham was set apart in a world of wandering nations and restless tribes. One day, God spoke to Abraham with a calling that would change the course of history. Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you, and I will make your name great. Through you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. Without hesitation, Abraham obeyed, taking his wife Sarah, his nephew Lot, and all their possessions. He set out into the unknown, guided only by faith. Their journey brought them to the land of Canaan. There, God appeared to Abraham again, promising, "To your descendants I will give this land." In gratitude, Abraham built an altar and worshipped out, but trials soon followed. A severe famine struck, forcing Abraham to go down to Egypt. Fearing for his life because of Sarah's beauty, he asked her to say she was his sister. When Pharaoh's officials brought her into the palace, God struck Pharaoh's household with plagues. Realizing the truth, Pharaoh returned Sarah to Abraham and sent them away with their possessions intact. Back in Canaan, strife arose between the herdsmen of Abraham and Lot, for the land could not sustain both of their great flocks. To preserve peace, Abraham offered Lot the choice of land. Lot chose the fertile plain of the Jordan and settled near Sodom, while Abraham remained in Canaan. God then reaffirmed his covenant, telling Abraham that his descendants would be as countless as the dust of the earth. Yet Abraham and Sarah still had no children. Doubt weighed heavily upon him. How could the promise be fulfilled? But God reassured him, "Look up at the heavens and count the stars, so shall your offspring be." Abraham believed, and his faith was counted as righteousness. To seal his promise, God made a covenant with Abraham. He instructed him to bring specific animals for sacrifice: a heifer, a goat, a ram, a dove, and a young pigeon. Abraham prepared them as commanded, laying the pieces opposite each other. As the sun set, a deep darkness fell, and in the night a smoking firepot and a blazing torch passed between the pieces. It was the sign of God's binding covenant. Abraham's descendants would inherit the land, and through them, God's plan for humanity would unfold. Ishmael. As the years passed and Sarah remained without children, doubt began to grow. Though God had promised Abraham many descendants, Sarah's barrenness weighed heavily on them both. In her desperation, Sarah offered her maidservant Hagar to Abraham, saying, "Perhaps I can build a family through her." Abraham agreed, and Hagar conceived. But soon, tension filled the household. Sarah's jealousy and Hagar's pride clashed, and conflict arose. Hurt and mistreated, Hagar fled into the wilderness. Yet there, by a spring of water, the angel of the Lord appeared to her. With words of both comfort and command, he said, "Return to your mistress and submit to her. I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count. You are with child, and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. He will be a wild man. His hand will be against everyone and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility toward all his brothers." Strengthened by this divine encounter, Hagar returned and bore a son. Abraham named him Ishmael, and Abraham was 86 years old at the time. Years later, When Abraham was 99, God appeared to him again with a renewed promise. He told Abraham that Sarah herself would bear him a son, to be named Isaac, and through Isaac the everlasting covenant would continue. As a sign of this covenant, God commanded Abraham to institute circumcision for himself, his household, and all his descendants, a physical mark of belonging to God's chosen people. Though Abraham and Sarah were old and the promise seemed impossible, they believed, and in their faith, the story of both Ishmael and Isaac began to unfold to sons, to destinies, both embraced by God's providence, yet leading to different nations and futures. Sodom and Gomorrah. When Abraham lived in the land of Canaan, nearby stood two cities infamous for their wickedness, Sodom and Gomorrah. The people there were known for cruelty, corruption, and every kind of evil. Their sins had become so great that God decided the cities could no longer remain. But before carrying out his judgment, God revealed his plan to Abraham. Moved by compassion, Abraham pleaded on behalf of the people. "Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked?" he asked. Beginning with 50 righteous people, Abraham bargained with God, asking if he would spare the city for their sake. Step by step, Abraham lowered the number until he reached 10. And God promised, if even 10 righteous people could be found, the cities would be spared. Meanwhile, 2 angels arrived in Sodom at evening. At the city gate, Abraham's nephew Lot greeted them and urged them to stay in his house for safety, for the streets were filled with violence. That night, the men of Sodom surrounded Lot's home, demanding that he bring out the visitors. Lot refused, protecting his guests even at great risk. The crowd grew violent, but the angels struck the men with blindness, so they could not find the door. At dawn, the angels warned Lot to gather his family and flee at once. Still, he hesitated, so the angels seized the hands of Lot, his wife, and his daughters, leading them out of the city. They commanded them, "Do not look back, and do not stop anywhere in the plain. Flee to the mountains, or you will be swept away." As Lot and his family escaped, God rained down fire and sulfur from the heavens, destroying Sodom, Gomorrah, and all their inhabitants. The once proud cities vanished in smoke and ash. But Lot's wife, disobeying the command, looked back. In that moment, she was turned into a pillar of salt forever, a reminder of the cost of defiance. Lot and his daughters found refuge in a cave in the hills. Believing they were the last survivors on earth, his daughters devised a desperate plan to preserve their family line. They gave their father wine and, one by one, bore children by him. Their sons became the ancestors of the Moabites and the Ammonites, nations that would play important roles in the story of Israel. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah stands as a solemn warning of divine judgment against sin. Yet within the devastation, we also see God's mercy, for he spared Lot and his family because of Abraham's intercession and Lot's faithfulness. It is a story of both wrath and grace, showing us the seriousness of evil and the power of God's deliverance for those who seek him. The birth of Isaac. Abraham and his wife Sarah lived faithfully in the land of Canaan, following the path God set before them. Yet, despite their devotion, one sorrow shadowed their lives. They had no children. Abraham was nearly 100 years old, and Sarah was 90. The years of waiting had drained Sarah's hope. Her heart was heavy with grief, and she had long given up on ever becoming a mother. But God had not forgotten his promise. One day, he appeared again to Abraham and repeated his covenant. "You will have a son, and through him your descendants will be as countless as the stars in the heavens and the sand on the seashore." Sarah, listening nearby, laughed silently to herself. How could such a thing be possible? She was far beyond the age of childbearing. Yet God asked, "Why does Sarah laugh? Is anything too hard for the Lord?" At the appointed time next year, Sarah will bear a son. And so, the impossible became reality. Sarah conceived, and in due season she gave birth to a son, just as God had promised. They named him Isaac, which means laughter. For Sarah had once laughed in disbelief, but now her laughter was filled with joy. Isaac's birth was a miracle, a living testimony that God's word never fails. Abraham and Sarah held their long-awaited child with hearts overflowing in gratitude. Every smile, every small step, every sound Isaac made reminded them that nothing is impossible for God. Isaac grew into a healthy and joyful boy, beloved by his parents. To Abraham and Sarah, he was more than a son, he was the embodiment of hope, the heir of God's promises, and a sign of his faithfulness. The story of Isaac teaches us that faith and hope, even when tested by the impossible, can open the way for miracles. When all seems lost, we are reminded that God's timing is perfect, and his promises never fail. The sacrifice of Isaac. One day, God chose to test Abraham's faith in the most profound way. He called out to Abraham, and Abraham answered, "Here I am." Then came the command that must have shaken Abraham to his core: "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah. There, offer him as a burnt sacrifice on a mountain I will show you." Abraham was stunned. This son, born of promise, the child through whom God had said nations would be blessed, was now to be given up. Yet Abraham did not argue. His faith was unshaken. He trusted that God had a purpose, even if he could not see it. Early the next morning, Abraham rose and prepared for the journey. He took Isaac, 2 servants, and a donkey loaded with wood for the offering. For 3 days they traveled, the weight of the command heavy on Abraham's heart. On the 3rd day, he saw the mountain in the distance. He told his servants, "Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there to worship, and then we will return." Abraham placed the wood on Isaac's shoulders, while he himself carried the fire and the knife. As they climbed, Isaac innocently asked, "Father, we have the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham replied with faith-filled words, "God himself will provide the lamb, my son." When they reached the place, Abraham built an altar and arranged the wood. Then, with trembling hands but unwavering obedience, he bound Isaac and laid him on the altar. He raised the knife, ready to surrender the child he loved most. At that very moment, the angel of the Lord called from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." He answered, "Here I am." The angel said, "Do not lay a hand on the boy. Do not harm him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld your son, your only son." Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught by its horns in a thicket. He took the ram and offered it in Isaac's place. In gratitude, Abraham named the place Jehovah-Jireh, "The Lord will provide." Then the angel of the Lord spoke again, "Because you have done this and not withheld your son, I will surely bless you. I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. Through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." Abraham and Isaac returned together to their servants and journeyed home. The test revealed the depth of Abraham's faith, willingness to trust God even when the command seemed impossible. This story became a lasting symbol of faith and obedience, a reminder that true trust means surrendering everything to God, believing that He will always provide. The burial of Sarah. The years passed, and Sarah, the beloved wife of Abraham, reached the fullness of her days. She lived to be 127 years old, a long life marked by faith, trials, and miracles. At last, in the city of Kiriath Arba, also called Hebron, in the land of Canaan, Sarah's earthly journey came to an end. Abraham was heartbroken. The woman who had walked beside him through deserts and foreign lands, who had shared his trials and witnessed the promises of God fulfilled, was now gone. His grief was deep, and yet even in mourning he remained steadfast and honorable. The Hittites, among whom Abraham lived, respected him greatly. They recognized him as a mighty prince and offered him the choice of any burial place he desired. Yet Abraham, in humility and fairness, did not want to accept land as a gift. Instead, he insisted on paying the full price, wishing the place of his wife's rest to belong to him by right. He spoke with Ephron son of Zohar, who owned a field with a cave at Machpelah. At first Ephron offered it freely, but Abraham declined the gesture and asked to pay. Ephron named the price for 100 shekels of silver. Without hesitation, Abraham weighed out the silver in the presence of witnesses. Thus the field of Machpelah, with its cave and trees, became Abraham's possession, secured as a family burial place. With reverence and love, Abraham laid Sarah to rest there. Honoring her with dignity, the cave of Machpelah would not only serve as Sarah's resting place, but would become the burial site of Abraham himself, along with their descendants Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Leah. It stood as a lasting symbol of God's promise that the land of Canaan would one day belong to Abraham's children. Sarah's burial was more than the end of a life. It was the beginning of a sacred heritage. The story reminds us of Abraham's integrity, his deep love for Sarah, and his trust in God's eternal covenant. Eliezer and Rebekah. After the passing of Sarah, Abraham turned his heart toward the future of his son, Isaac. He longed for Isaac to have a wife, but not from the Canaanites among whom they dwell. Instead, he wanted her to come from his own kin, the family of his ancestors. So Abraham called for his trusted servant, Eliezer, and gave him a solemn mission: "Go to my homeland, to my relatives, and find a wife there for my son Isaac." Obedient and faithful, Eliezer set out on the journey, taking with him 10 camels laden with gifts. As he approached the city of Nahor, Abraham's ancestral home, Eliezer prayed earnestly to God for guidance. He asked for a sign. "Let it be that when I ask a young woman for water, she not only gives me a drink but also offers water for my camels. By this I will know that she is the one you have chosen for Isaac." At the well outside the city, Eliezer saw a young woman approach with a pitcher on her shoulder. Her name was Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel, granddaughter of Nahor. She was beautiful and kind. Eliezer asked her for a little water, and without hesitation, she gave him a drink. Then, with remarkable generosity, she drew water until all his camels were satisfied. It was the very sign he had prayed for. Overjoyed, Eliezer gave Rebekah gold bracelets and a nose ring as gifts and asked about her family. When he learned she was indeed from Abraham's kin, he bowed his head and worshipped God, thanking him for leading him to the chosen bride. Eliezer was invited to Rebekah's family home, where he recounted his mission and all that had transpired at the well. Her family, including her brother Laban, listened respectfully and agreed that this was the will of God. Rebekah herself, showing both courage and faith, agreed to leave her home and travel with Eliezer to marry Isaac. The caravan set out, and as they approached the land of Canaan, Isaac was in the fields, meditating and praying. When Rebekah saw him from a distance, she descended from her camel and asked, "Who is that man in the field?" Eliezer replied, "That is my master." Rebekah veiled herself in modesty and reverence. Isaac welcomed her and brought her into the tent of his mother, Sarah. There she became his wife, and he loved her deeply. Rebekah was not only a bride but also a comfort to Isaac, bringing healing and joy after the sorrow of his mother's death. Abraham and Keturah. Thus one chapter of Abraham's life came to a close, and another began, filled with hope and renewal. After the death of Sarah, Abraham, now an elderly man yet still strong in spirit, took another wife named Keturah. Through her, Abraham's family grew once more, for she bore him several children: Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shual. These sons became the forefathers of new tribes and peoples, spreading out into the lands of the east. Though Abraham loved all his children, he understood the importance of preserving the covenant God had made with Isaac, to secure peace and avoid future conflict. Abraham gave gifts to the sons of Keturah and sent them eastward, away from Isaac, while ensuring that Isaac remained the sole heir to his inheritance and to God's promises. In his later years, Abraham found comfort in seeing Isaac and Rebekah together. Their union brought him joy, for Isaac had found not only a wife but a source of love and healing after the loss of Sarah. Watching his descendants grow, Abraham remained a respected patriarch, admired for his wisdom, faith, and steadfast devotion to God. Even as time wore on, Abraham continued to inspire those around him. His life, marked by trials, journeys, blessings, and covenants, was a living testimony of trust in God's promises. The sons of Keturah carried forth their own destinies, but through Isaac, the line of the covenant continued, ensuring that Abraham's legacy of faith would echo through the generations. The death of Abraham. When Abraham reached 175 years, he felt that his time on earth was drawing to an end. His life had been long and full, marked by journeys through deserts, trials of faith, and the fulfillment of God's promises. He had seen the birth of Isaac, the continuation of his lineage, and the assurance that his descendants would become a great nation. Abraham passed away in a good old age, satisfied with years, and was gathered to his people. His sons, Isaac and Ishmael, though separated by circumstance, came together to honor their father. With reverence, they laid him to rest in the cave of Machpelah, beside his beloved wife Sarah. This sacred burial place had become the family tomb, a symbol of unity between generations and a reminder of God's covenant. After Abraham's death, God's blessing passed to Isaac, who made his dwelling near the well of Beer-lahai-roi. Isaac continued the covenant path, walking in faith as his father had done. The torch of promise had been handed down, ensuring that Abraham's legacy would endure. Abraham's life stands as a testimony of unwavering trust in God. He was not only the patriarch of his family, but also a symbol of courage, obedience, and faith for countless generations to come. His story became the foundation upon which nations and destinies were built. Thus ended the earthly journey of Abraham, the friend of God, whose faith carried him through every trial, and whose descendants would shape the course of history. Isaac. Not long after Abraham's death, Isaac himself faced challenges. A famine struck the land of Canaan, and Isaac wondered how his family would survive. Remembering the stories of his father, he considered going down to Egypt. But God appeared to him and said, "Do not go to Egypt. Stay in this land, and I will be with you and bless you. To you and your descendants I will give these lands, as I promised to your father Abraham." Trusting God, Isaac settled in the land of Gerar, known for its fertile fields. Yet he carried the same fears his father once had. Rebekah, his wife, was beautiful, and Isaac worried that the men of Gerar might kill him to take her. So he said she was his sister, hoping to protect them both. But soon, King Abimelech noticed Isaac and Rebekah's closeness and realized the truth. He confronted Isaac, saying, "She is your wife. Why did you say she was your sister?" Isaac admitted his fear, and the king, angered by the deception, nevertheless issued a decree that no one was to harm Isaac or Rebekah. Isaac continued to live in Gerar, planting crops and raising flocks. God's blessing was upon him. His fields yielded abundantly, and his herds multiplied until he became wealthy and powerful. This prosperity stirred envy among the Philistines. They stopped up the wells that Abraham's servants had once dug, cutting off Isaac's access to water. Finally, Abimelech told him, "Move away from us, for you have become too powerful." Isaac departed to the valley of Gerar, where he reopened his father's wells. Each time his servants dug, local shepherds quarreled with them over the water. Isaac named the first well Esek dispute, and the second Sitnah hostility. At last, he dug a third well, and this time there was no quarrel. He called it Rehoboth Room, saying, "Now the Lord has given us space, and we will flourish in the land." Later, Isaac went to Beersheba. There, God appeared to him again, reaffirming his promise, "I am the God of your father Abraham. Do not be afraid, for I am with you." I will bless you and multiply your descendants for my servant Abraham's sake." Grateful, Isaac built an altar, called on the name of the Lord, and pitched his tent there. His servants dug yet another well, securing water for their household. Soon after, Abimelech arrived with his advisors. Isaac, remembering their hostility, asked why they had come. Abimelech replied, "We clearly see that the Lord is with you. Let there be peace between us." They made a covenant, shared a feast, and departed in friendship. On that very day, Isaac's servants found water in the new well, which Isaac named Sheba. The city became known as Beersheba, the well of Doth. Isaac and Rebekah had twin sons, Esau and Jacob. As the boys grew, Esau became a skillful hunter, while Jacob was quiet and preferred the tents. Later, Esau's marriages to Hittite women brought grief to his parents. Still, Isaac remained steadfast in faith, walking in the covenant of Abraham. Through trials and blessings, God continued to uphold his promise, and Isaac's life became another link in the chain of faith that would shape the destiny of nations. Jacob and Esau. Isaac and Rebekah had twin sons, Esau and Jacob. Even from the moment of their birth, it was clear that their lives would follow different paths. Esau, the firstborn, emerged red and covered with hair, and by birthright he was entitled to the inheritance of the firstborn, a double share of his father's estate, and a special blessing. Jacob came out grasping Esau's heel, a symbolic gesture of the rivalry that would shape their lives. As they grew, their differences became more pronounced. Esau was a man of the fields, a hunter who thrived outdoors, while Jacob preferred a quieter life, staying close to home. Isaac favored Esau for the game he brought, but Rebekah loved Jacob dearly. One day, Esau returned from hunting, exhausted and hungry, to find Jacob cooking a stew. Desperate for food, Esau asked for some. Seizing the moment, Jacob offered the stew in exchange for Esau's birthright. Thinking only of his immediate hunger, Esau agreed, selling away his inheritance for a simple meal. Years later, when Isaac had grown old and nearly blind, he decided to bestow his blessing on Esau. But Rebekah, determined that Jacob should receive the blessing instead, devised a plan. She dressed Jacob in Esau's clothes and covered his arms and neck with goat skins to mimic Esau's hairy skin. Jacob brought his father a meal prepared by Rebekah, and Isaac, though suspicious, blessed him, passing on the covenant of Abraham. When Esau discovered the deception, he was furious and vowed to kill Jacob. To save him, Rebekah urged Jacob to flee to her brother Laban in Haran. There Jacob fell in love with Laban's daughter Rachel and agreed to serve 7 years to marry her. But Laban tricked him, giving him his older daughter Leah instead. Jacob then served another 7 years for Rachel, enduring hardship but eventually building a family with both wives. Over time, Jacob became prosperous, and God commanded him to return to his homeland. Fearing Esau's wrath, Jacob prayed for protection. On the eve of their meeting, Jacob had a mysterious encounter. He wrestled through the night with a man who was revealed to be an angel. At dawn, the angel blessed him and gave him a new name, Israel, meaning one who struggles with God. When Jacob finally met Esau, he was anxious. Yet, to his surprise, Esau embraced him, forgiving the past. The brothers reconciled, and peace was restored. Jacob settled in Canaan, and his family grew into a great household. The story of Jacob and Esau is one of rivalry, deception, struggle, and ultimately forgiveness. It reminds us that even in the deepest conflicts, reconciliation is possible, and God's will can transform strife into blessing. Jacob had 12 sons, but among them Joseph held a special place in his heart. He was the firstborn of Rachel, Jacob's beloved wife, and for that reason Jacob loved him more than the others. To show his affection, Jacob gave Joseph a richly ornamented robe, a coat of many colors. This gift, along with Joseph's favored status, stirred envy and bitterness in the hearts of his brothers. Joseph also began to have dreams, which further fueled their jealousy. In one dream, he saw his sheaf of grain standing upright while the sheaves of his brothers bowed down before it. In another, the sun, moon, and 11 stars bowed to him. These dreams hinted at future authority and caused his brothers to despise him even more. One day, when Joseph went to visit his brothers in the fields, they conspired against him. At first, some wanted to kill him, but Judah persuaded them to sell him instead. They sold Joseph to passing merchants for 20 pieces of silver, who carried him away to Egypt. To cover their crime, the brothers dipped his robe in goat's blood and told Jacob that Joseph had been devoured by wild beasts. Heartbroken, Jacob mourned for his son and refused to be comforted. In Egypt, Joseph was sold to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh. God was with Joseph, and everything he touched prospered. But when Potiphar's wife falsely accused him, Joseph was cast into prison. Even there, he remained faithful, and God's favor lifted him up. Soon he was entrusted with managing the affairs of the prison. In time, Joseph interpreted the dreams of two fellow prisoners, the cupbearer and the baker of Pharaoh. His interpretations proved true, and when Pharaoh later had troubling dreams that none of his wise men could explain, the restored cupbearer remembered Joseph. Brought before Pharaoh, Joseph revealed that the dreams foretold 7 years of abundance followed by 7 years of famine. Impressed by his wisdom, Pharaoh placed Joseph as second in command over all Egypt, tasking him with preparing the land for the famine. When the famine came, it spread far beyond Egypt, reaching even Canaan, where Jacob and his family lived. Hearing that grain was available in Egypt, Jacob sent his sons to buy food. They stood before Joseph but did not recognize him. Joseph, however, knew them. To test their hearts, he accused them of being spies and demanded that they bring their youngest brother, Benjamin. Reluctantly, the brothers returned home and brought Benjamin back to Egypt. Joseph welcomed them with a feast but secretly placed his silver cup in Benjamin's sack. When the supposed theft was discovered, the brothers pleaded for mercy. Judah offered himself as a slave in place of Benjamin, showing a spirit of sacrifice and repentance. Moved to tears, Joseph revealed his identity. His brothers were struck with fear, but Joseph comforted them. "Do not be distressed or angry with yourselves, for it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you." He assured them it was God's plan, not theirs, that had brought him to Egypt. Joseph invited his father Jacob and all his household to settle in Egypt, where Pharaoh gave them the best land in Goshen. Jacob lived there peacefully for 17 years before passing away, blessing his sons and grandchildren. Joseph continued to care for his family, forgiving the past and securing their future. He lived a long and prosperous life, always mindful that his suffering and triumphs alike had been woven into God's greater plan. Joseph's story is one of betrayal and redemption, of trials turned into blessings, and of forgiveness stronger than vengeance. Moses. Many years passed after Jacob's descendants had settled in Egypt. The Israelites grew into a vast nation, so numerous that a new Pharaoh who knew nothing of Joseph began to fear them. Seeing their strength in numbers, he enslaved them, forcing them into harsh labor to build cities and monuments. Yet the more he oppressed them, the more they multiplied. In his cruelty, Pharaoh commanded that every newborn Hebrew boy be killed. During this dark time, a child was born to a Hebrew family. His parents hid him as long as they could, but when it became too dangerous, his mother placed him in a woven basket and set him afloat on the Nile. Entrusting him to God's care, Pharaoh's daughter found the basket while bathing in the river. Seeing the crying infant, her heart was moved with compassion. She decided to raise him as her own, naming him Moses, meaning drawn out of the water. By God's providence, Moses' own mother became his nurse. So he grew up knowing his heritage even while receiving an Egyptian education in the palace. As an adult, Moses witnessed the suffering of his people. One day, he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave. In anger, Moses struck the Egyptian and killed him. When the deed was discovered, Pharaoh sought to take his life, and Moses fled into the wilderness. He found refuge in Midian, where he became a shepherd and married Zipporah, the daughter of Jethro, a local priest. One day, while tending the flock near Mount Horeb, Moses saw a remarkable sight: a bush that burned with fire yet was not consumed. As he approached, the voice of God called to him from the flames, "Moses, Moses, I have seen the suffering of my people in Egypt. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring them out of slavery." Moses trembled at this calling, feeling unworthy and uncertain. But God gave him signs: his staff turning into a serpent, his hand becoming leprous, and then healed, proofs of divine power. God assured him, "I will be with you," with faith strengthened, and his brother Aaron as his helper. Moses returned to Egypt to confront Pharaoh and lay trials, wonders, and miracles, the beginning of the great deliverance. Moses had been chosen to lead God's people out of bondage and toward freedom. God's power over Pharaoh. With courage renewed by God's call, Moses and his brother Aaron returned to Egypt to deliver the Lord's command, "Let my people go, that they may serve me in the wilderness." But Pharaoh's heart was hard. Not only did he refuse, but he increased the burden of the Israelites, forcing them to gather their own straw for bricks while still meeting their daily quota. God then revealed his power through a series of 10 devastating plagues, each one more severe than the last. To break Pharaoh's defiance and show that the Lord alone rules over all creation, the first plague, water into blood. Moses struck the Nile with his staff, and its waters turned to blood. Fish died, the river stank, and the Egyptians could not drink from it. The second plague, frogs swarmed out of the rivers and filled homes, beds, and even kitchens. In desperation, Pharaoh asked Moses to pray for relief. But when the frogs died, he hardened his heart again. The third plague, gnats. At Moses' word, the dust of the earth became gnats, tormenting people and animals alike. The fourth plague, flies. Swarms of flies filled Egypt, but not the land of Goshen, where the Israelites lived. God made a distinction between his people and the Egyptians. The fifth plague, death of livestock. Egypt's animals fell dead, while not a single Israelite herd was harmed. The sixth plague, boils. Moses and Aaron tossed ashes into the air, and painful boils broke out on Egyptians and their livestock. The seventh plague, hail. Mighty storm of thunder and hail rained down, shattering crops, killing livestock, and striking fear into the people. Only Goshen was spared. The eighth plague, locusts devoured what little remained after the hail, leaving Egypt barren. The ninth plague, darkness for 3 days. Thick darkness covered Egypt, so dense that no one could see or move. Yet Israel had light in their dwellings. The 10th plague, death of the firstborn. The final judgment fell on every Egyptian household. From Pharaoh's palace to the lowliest servant, every firstborn son died. But the Israelites, who obeyed God's command to sacrifice a lamb and mark their doorposts with its blood, were spared as the angel of death passed over their homes. Stricken with grief after losing his own son, Pharaoh finally yielded. In the dead of night, he summoned Moses and Aaron and ordered them to leave Egypt with their people, their flocks, and their herds. The Israelites departed in haste, carrying with them gold, silver, and provisions given by the Egyptians. God himself went before them, guiding them by a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. Thus, after centuries of bondage, the children of Israel were free. Their journey toward the promised land had begun, a journey shaped by miracles, trials, and the steadfast hand of God leading them forward. The crossing of the Red Sea. After Pharaoh finally allowed the Israelites to leave, they began their journey out of Egypt. God himself led them, by day in a pillar of cloud to guide their steps, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light. With his presence before them, they could march by day and by night without fear. Their path led them toward the shores of the Red Sea. But soon, Pharaoh's heart hardened again. Regretting that he had let his slaves go, he gathered his chariots and soldiers and set out in pursuit. The thunder of horses' hooves and the clatter of iron wheels drew closer. When the Israelites saw the Egyptian army approaching, they were terrified. Trapped between Pharaoh's army and the sea, they cried out in despair, "It would have been better for us to remain slaves in Egypt than to die here in the wilderness." But Moses stood firm. He lifted his voice and said, "Do not be afraid. Stand still, and you will see the salvation of the Lord. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." Then God commanded Moses to raise his staff over the sea. As he did, the waters of the Red Sea parted, driven back by a mighty wind. Before the people opened a dry path, with walls of water standing on either side. The Israelites stepped forward, walking across the seabed in awe. Pharaoh's army charged in after them, but God threw the Egyptians into confusion. Their chariots became stuck, their wheels heavy, and panic spread among the soldiers. Once the last Israelite had safely crossed, the Lord commanded Moses to stretch out his hand again. The waters returned to their place with a roaring crash, engulfing Pharaoh's army. Not one of them survived. On the far shore, the Israelites stood safe, watching as the sea closed over their enemies. In that moment, they saw with their own eyes the power of their God. Their fear turned into faith, and their despair into song. Moses and the people of Israel lifted their voices in praise, declaring, "The Lord is my strength and my song. He has become my salvation." Manna from heaven and water from the rock. After crossing the Red Sea, the Israelites were free, but freedom brought new challenges. In the wilderness, they soon began to thirst. The only water they found was bitter and undrinkable. Desperate, the people complained against Moses. Moses cried out to God, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood. When Moses cast it into the waters, the bitterness vanished, and the water became sweet and safe to drink. God revealed himself once again as the provider for his people. Yet soon after, hunger troubled the camp. The Israelites grumbled, longing for the food they had in Egypt. In response, God gave them a miraculous gift, manna, a special bread from heaven. Each morning, the ground was covered with fine flakes, white like frost. The people gathered it, ground it, and baked it into bread. It tasted sweet, like wafers made with honey. God also sent quail each evening, so the people had meat to eat. But he gave them one command. They were to gather only enough manna for each day, trusting that he would provide again tomorrow. On the sixth day, however, they were to gather twice as much, for none would fall on the Sabbath. Through this, God tested their obedience and taught them reliance on him alone. Still, the journey through the desert was not without further trials. At Rephidim, there was no water again, and the people quarreled bitterly with Moses. Once more, Moses turned to God. The Lord instructed him to strike a rock with his staff. Moses obeyed, and water burst forth from the stone, flowing in abundance so that all the people and their livestock could drink. These miracles became lasting signs that God sustains his people not by human strength, but by his power and grace. Bread from heaven, meat in the evening, and water from solid rock. Every gift was a reminder that the Lord was with them, even in the wilderness. The Amalekite attacked as the Israelites journeyed through the wilderness. They reached a place called Rephidim, but their progress was suddenly threatened. Amalek, a hostile tribe, came out to attack them. It was the first great battle Israel would face after leaving Egypt. Moses called upon Joshua, a young leader full of courage, and instructed him to gather men for the fight. While Joshua led the warriors into battle, Moses climbed a hill overlooking the battlefield, carrying the staff of God in his hands. From that height, a strange and powerful pattern emerged. Whenever Moses raised his hands with the staff, the Israelites prevailed. But when his arms grew weary and sank, the Amalekites began to gain the upper hand. Seeing this, Aaron, Moses' brother, and Hur rushed to his side. They placed a stone for him to sit on, and each man supported one of his arms, holding them steady until the sun went down. With Moses' hands upheld and God's power with them, Joshua and the Israelite army defeated Amalek. This moment was not only a military victory, but also a lesson that their strength came not from swords or numbers, but from the presence and support of God. After the battle, Moses was reunited with his father-in-law, Jethro, who brought Moses' wife and children back to him. Jethro observed how Moses tried to judge every dispute among the people by himself and wisely counseled him, "You will wear yourself out. Appoint capable men as judges over smaller matters, and reserve only the most important cases for yourself." Bringing them before God, Moses accepted this advice, easing his burden and ensuring justice among the people. Thus, Israel's journey through the desert continued, marked by battles, hardships, and miracles, but through it all, God revealed his strength and care for his chosen people. The law at Mount Sinai. After a long and difficult journey through the desert, the Israelites finally arrived at the foot of Mount Sinai. Here, God chose to enter into a covenant with his people and give them his divine law. Moses ascended the mountain, and God spoke to him, "If the people obey my covenant and keep my commands, they will be my treasured possession, a kingdom of priests, and a holy nation." When Moses returned to the camp and shared these words, the people answered with one voice, "All that the Lord has spoken, we will do." God then instructed Moses to prepare the people for a great revelation. For 3 days they purified themselves, washed their garments, and refrained from daily work. On the third morning, thunder rolled across the skies, lightning flashed, and a thick cloud enveloped the mountaintop. The sound of a trumpet grew louder and louder, and all the people trembled in awe and fear. Moses led the people to the foot of the mountain. Mount Sinai shook violently, and smoke rose like the smoke of a great furnace, for the Lord descended in fire. There, amid the thunder and the blazing presence, God called Moses up to the mountain and gave him the 10 Commandments, engraved on tablets of stone. These commandments laid the foundation for Israel's life with God, to worship the Lord alone, and never turn to idols or carved images. To honor his name with reverence and never use it in vain. To keep the Sabbath holy, working for 6 days and resting on the 7th in dedication to him. To honor father and mother, with the promise of long life. To not murder, for life is sacred. To not commit adultery, preserving the sanctity of marriage. To not steal, respecting the property of others. To not bear false witness, ensuring truth and justice. To not covet what belongs to another, guarding the heart from envy and greed. But God gave more than these 10 laws. He revealed instructions for daily justice and mercy, how to treat servants, strangers, and the poor, how to resolve disputes fairly, and how to keep sacred feasts and festivals. Through these commands, God shaped a people set apart, called to live in righteousness. When Moses descended and read all of God's words to the people, they once again promised, "All that the Lord has spoken, we will obey." Moses built an altar at the base of the mountain and sealed the covenant with blood, symbolizing the bond between God and his people. Later, Moses, Aaron's sons, and 70 elders ascended partway up the mountain. There they beheld a vision of the God of Israel. Beneath his feet stretched a pavement like sapphire, clear as the heavens. They ate and drank in his presence, confirming the covenant. Then God called Moses higher, commanding him to remain on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. There, Moses received detailed instructions for Israel's worship, the building of the tabernacle, and the laws that would guide their community. On the mountaintop, enveloped in cloud and fire, God entrusted Moses with the stone tablets, the eternal sign of his covenant with his chosen nation. The golden calf. While Moses remained on Mount Sinai for 40 days and nights, the people of Israel grew restless. They began to fear that Moses would never return, and anxiety turned into rebellion. They gathered around Aaron, Moses' brother, and demanded, "Make us gods who will go before us." As for this Moses who brought us out of Egypt, we don't know what has become of him. Aaron, under pressure, told them to bring their gold earrings and ornaments. He melted them down and shaped the metal into a calf. The people rejoiced, proclaiming, "This is your God, O Israel, who brought you out of Egypt." They built an altar before the idol, offered sacrifices, and celebrated with feasting, dancing, and revelry. On the mountain, God saw their corruption and told Moses, "Go down at once. Your people have turned aside quickly from the way I commanded them. They have made for themselves a golden calf and are bowing down to it." God's wrath burned, but Moses pleaded for mercy. Descending the mountain, Moses carried the 2 tablets of stone engraved by the very hand of God. But when he saw the calf and the people dancing around it, his fury erupted. He hurled the tablets down, shattering them at the foot of the mountain. Then he destroyed the idol, burning it in fire, grinding it into powder, scattering it over water, and making the Israelites drink it as a bitter lesson. Moses turned to Aaron and demanded, "What did these people do to you, that you led them into such great sin?" Aaron weakly replied that the people pressured him, and that he had only thrown the gold into the fire, and out came this calf. Moses stood at the entrance to the camp and cried out, "Whoever is for the Lord, come to me." The sons of Levi rallied to him. By Moses' command, they went through the camp, striking down those who persisted in rebellion. That day, about 3,000 people perished. The next morning, Moses returned to the mountain to intercede for the nation. He prayed earnestly that God would forgive their great sin. God responded, "Lead the people to the place I promised. My angel will go before you, but in the day of my judgment, I will punish them for their sin." Then God commanded Moses to chisel 2 new stone tablets, and upon them he rewrote the commandments that had been broken. Through this, God renewed his covenant with Israel. But the memory of the golden calf remained as a stark warning of how quickly human hearts can stray when fear and impatience replace faith. The renewed covenant after the sin of the golden calf. God called Moses once again to ascend Mount Sinai. This time, Moses was commanded to carve 2 new stone tablets, so that God himself could inscribe upon them the 10 Commandments, once more the very foundation of his covenant with Israel. For 40 days and 40 nights, Moses remained on the mountain in God's presence. During that time, the Lord renewed his covenant, declaring his mercy, compassion, and steadfast love, yet also his justice. God promised to lead the people into the land he had sworn to their ancestors Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and to drive out the nations that dwelled there. But he also gave a solemn warning: Israel must remain faithful, never worship other gods, and never fashion idols, for their God is a jealous and holy God. When Moses finally descended from the mountain, he carried in his hands the new tablets of the covenant. But something extraordinary had happened. His face shone with a radiant light from being in the presence of the Lord. The glory of God reflected so strongly that the people were afraid to come near him. To reassure them, Moses placed a veil over his face whenever he spoke with the people. But when he entered the presence of God, he removed the veil. Moses delivered God's laws and instructions to the Israelites. And once again the people pledged their obedience. They would follow the Lord alone, serve him faithfully, and walk in his ways. Thus, God forgave his people and restored his covenant with them, reaffirming that they were his chosen nation. The renewed covenant was not only a sign of God's mercy but also a reminder of the seriousness of faithfulness and obedience. Despite their failure, God's grace prevailed, showing that his plan for his people would not be broken. The tabernacle of the sanctuary. After forgiving the Israelites for the sin of the golden calf, God gave Moses detailed instructions for building a dwelling place, a sanctuary where his presence would rest among his people. This sacred tent, known as the tabernacle, was to be the visible sign that God himself would live in their midst. At the call for offerings, Moses gathered the Israelites and spoke God's command. The Lord has ordered us to build him a sanctuary. Whoever is willing and whose heart is generous, let them bring an offering. At once, men and women came forward with joy. They brought gold, silver, bronze, precious stones, fine fabrics, animal skins, and all kinds of materials needed. Some gave their personal jewelry, while skilled artisans dedicated their time and talents to the work. The skilled craftsmen God appointed Bezalel and Oholiab as the chief craftsmen. Filled with wisdom, skill, and understanding, they guided the work and taught others. Under their hands, beautiful and sacred objects were created: golden ornaments, woven garments, engraved stones, and richly dyed cloth. Every detail was carried out exactly as God had commanded. The sacred structure. The tabernacle was made up of different sections. The Holy of Holies, most holy place. At its heart stood the Ark of the Covenant, crafted from acacia wood and overlaid with pure gold. Upon it were two golden cherubim, wings outstretched, guarding the mercy seat. Inside the ark were placed the tablets of the 10 Commandments, Aaron's staff that had budded, and a jar of manna. The holy place, in front of the veil that separated it from the Holy of Holies, stood the golden lampstand, the table of the bread of the presence, and the altar of incense. Here the priests ministered daily, lighting the lamps and offering prayers. The outer court, enclosed by curtains. It contained the bronze altar for burnt offerings and the bronze basin for ritual washing, where sacrifices were made and priests cleansed themselves before entering. The priestly garments, special attention was given to the garments for the priests' robes of fine linen, breastpieces adorned with precious stones, golden sashes, and the sacred turban bearing the inscription "Holy to the Lord." These garments symbolized holiness and dedication to service, the completion and consecration when all the work was finished. Moses inspected every item and found that it was made exactly according to God's instructions. He blessed the people for their faithfulness and devotion. On the first day of the first month of the second year after leaving Egypt, the tabernacle was erected. Moses anointed it with oil, consecrating it and all its furnishings for holy service. The priests, clothed in their sacred garments, began their ministry. God's glory fills the tabernacle. Then an awe-inspiring sign appeared. A cloud descended and covered the tabernacle, and the glory of the Lord filled it so completely that even Moses could not enter. From that moment, the cloud rested over the sanctuary by day, and by night it appeared as a pillar of fire. Whenever the cloud lifted, the Israelites set out. When it stayed, they camped. In this way, the Lord himself guided his people through the wilderness, protecting and leading them step by step. Joshua, the conquest of Canaan. After the death of Moses, God chose Joshua, son of Nun, as the new leader of Israel. To him God gave these words of strength: "Be strong and courageous. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. Do not be afraid, for I will never leave you." With this assurance, Joshua prepared to lead the people into the land promised to their ancestors. The spies and Rahab before Israel could cross the Jordan and begin their conquest. Joshua sent 2 men as spies to scout out the city of Jericho. Jericho was not just any city, it was a fortress, surrounded by towering walls, heavily guarded, and known for its strength. To the people of Israel, it represented the first and most daunting obstacle in claiming the land that God had promised them. The 2 spies slipped quietly into the city and sought a place to hide. There they found shelter in the house of Rahab, a woman whose life stood on the margins of society. Though she was a prostitute, Rahab had already heard of the God of Israel and his mighty deeds, how he dried up the Red Sea, how he defeated the kings beyond the Jordan. And like the rest of her people, she believed that Israel's God was the true God, ruler of heaven and earth. When the king of Jericho learned that spies had entered the city, he sent messengers demanding that Rahab hand them over. But Rahab, With quick thinking and courage, hid the men on the roof of her house under bundles of flax. She misled the soldiers, saying the men had already left at dusk and urging them to pursue them quickly. The soldiers rushed out of the city gates, and the gates were shut, leaving the spies hidden safely in her home. That night, Rahab went up to the spies and confessed her faith. "I know that the Lord has given you this land," she said, "for fear of you has fallen upon us, and all who dwell in this land are melting away. We have heard of the Lord's mighty hand, and I know your God is the God in heaven above and on the earth below." Then she pleaded for her life and the lives of her family, her father and mother, her brothers and sisters, and all who belonged to them. She asked that when Israel came to destroy Jericho, her household would be spared. The spies agreed and gave her a sign. She was to hang a scarlet cord from her window, the same window through which she would let them down by a rope so they could escape the city. That crimson cord would serve as a mark of safety, a sign of covenant and mercy. With her help, the spies descended from her window, scaled down the city wall, and fled into the hills until their pursuers gave up the search. When they returned to Joshua, they brought not only news of Jericho's defenses but also a testimony of God's power. "Truly the Lord has given all the land into our hands. The people there are terrified because of us." Thus Rahab's act of faith not only saved her family, but also marked her place in Israel's history. She, a woman of Jericho, became part of the people of God and generations later, part of the lineage of King David and of Jesus himself, crossing the Jordan at last. The long wilderness journey brought the people of Israel to the banks of the Jordan River. It was springtime, and the river was swollen with floodwaters, rushing fiercely, deep and wide. To the human eye, crossing was impossible, an impassable barrier standing between them and the promised land. But God had already prepared the way. He commanded that the priests carry the Ark of the Covenant, the sacred chest that held the tablets of the law and symbolized his presence, and step into the river first. As the priests obediently advanced, the crowd held its breath. Their feet touched the edge of the waters, and in that very moment, the raging current halted. The river stopped flowing, and the waters piled up far upstream in a great invisible wall, leaving the riverbed dry before them. What had been a torrent of danger became a highway of safety. The people began to cross. Tribe after tribe, family after family, men, women, and children with their flocks and belongings all walked through the Jordan on dry ground, just as their parents had once crossed the Red Sea under Moses. For them, this was not merely a passage of geography, but a passage of faith, the final step from wandering into promise. Joshua then commanded 12 men, one from each tribe, to take a stone from the dry riverbed where the priests stood holding the ark. These stones were heavy, rough, and really yet each would stand as a testimony to God's power. When the crossing was complete and the priests came out of the river, the waters rushed back into their place, flowing as before, on the other side, at Gilgal. Joshua set up the 12 stones as a memorial. He declared, "In the future, when your children ask, 'What do these stones mean?' you shall tell them, 'The waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord.' These stones are a reminder forever of God's faithfulness." Thus, the Jordan became not a boundary but a gateway, and the stones stood as a silent witness, reminding every generation that what is impossible for man is possible with God. The fall of Jericho. The first great challenge awaiting Israel in the Promised Land was Jericho, a city famous for its massive walls, fortified gates, and seasoned warriors. To human eyes, it was impenetrable. But God's plan was unlike any military strategy ever known. Joshua received instructions that defied logic. For 6 days, the entire army was to march once around the city in silence, while 7 priests walked ahead of the Ark of the Covenant, blowing long notes on their ram's horn trumpets. The people obeyed, circling the city day after day, saying nothing, only the haunting sound of the trumpets echoing off the walls. Inside Jericho, fear gripped the hearts of its inhabitants. They watched in dread as the Israelites marched silently around their fortress, their strange ritual heavy with mystery. On the seventh day, Joshua commanded the people to rise early. This time they circled the city not once but 7 times. The priests blew the trumpets louder and longer, the people's anticipation growing with every step. On the 7th circuit, Joshua cried out, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city." At the final blast of the trumpets, the people raised a mighty shout, a roar of faith and victory. In that instant, the ground trembled, and the towering walls of Jericho collapsed, crumbling before their eyes. What no army could conquer by strength, God brought down by his power. The Israelites rushed into the city and captured it completely. But as promised, Rahab, a woman who had hidden the spies, and her entire household were spared. She was brought safely out of Jericho and joined the people of Israel, becoming part of their story and God's unfolding plan. Thus the conquest of Jericho was not merely a military victory. It was a declaration that the land belonged to the Lord, and that his power, not human might, would lead his people into their inheritance. Victory and setbacks. After the miraculous fall of Jericho, Israel was confident that nothing could stop them. Their next target was the smaller city of Ai. Joshua sent men to spy it out, and they reported back, "Do not send all the people. Only 2,000 or 3,000 men are needed, for they are few." But hidden in the camp was a secret sin. A man named Achan had disobeyed God's command to destroy all the treasures of Jericho. He had taken for himself a beautiful cloak, silver, and gold, and hidden them beneath his tent. Though no one else knew, God saw it, and because of this sin, his blessing was withdrawn. When Israel attacked Ai with confidence, disaster struck. The men of Ai struck them down and chased them from the gates. Israel was stunned, and fear spread through the camp. Joshua fell before the ark of the Lord, crying out, "Why have you brought us across the Jordan only to deliver us into the hands of our enemies?" God answered firmly, "Israel has sinned. They have taken what is devoted to destruction. I will not be with you unless you remove the sin from among you." The next day, the tribes were brought before the Lord, and by lot Achan was revealed. Joshua confronted him, and Achan confessed, "I have sinned against the Lord. I saw a beautiful Babylonian robe, 200 shekels of silver, and a bar of gold. I coveted them and took them. They are hidden in the ground beneath my tent." The stolen things were recovered, and Achan, along with his family, was judged for his sin. Israel understood that disobedience to God, even by one person, could bring defeat upon the whole nation. After this cleansing, the Lord told Joshua not to fear, but to rise and attack Ai again. This time, he gave them a strategy. Joshua set an ambush behind the city. When Ai's soldiers came out to fight, Israel feigned retreat, drawing them away. Then the ambush rushed in, set the city ablaze, and Ai was surrounded. Israel defeated Ai completely, and Joshua built an altar to the Lord, renewing the covenant and reminding the people that their strength came not from numbers or weapons, but from obedience to God. Miracles in battle. The victories of Israel spread quickly through the land, and fear gripped the hearts of its kings. Among them were the people of Gibeon, who chose cunning instead of war. Disguising themselves with worn-out clothes and moldy bread, they came to Joshua pretending to be travelers from a faraway land. "Make a treaty with us," they pleaded. Without seeking the counsel of the Lord, Israel agreed and swore an oath of peace. Not long after, the truth was uncovered. The Gibeonites were neighbors, living just a few miles away. Yet because of the covenant sworn before God, Israel honored the agreement and spared them, making them servants of the sanctuary. This act of mercy angered the surrounding kings. 5 Amorite rulers, those of Jerusalem, Hebron, Jarmuth, Lachish, and Eglon, joined forces to crush Gibeon for aligning with Israel. The Gibeonites sent urgent messengers to Joshua, "Do not abandon your servants. Come quickly and save us." Joshua responded without hesitation. He gathered his army and marched all night from Gilgal, climbing the rocky paths until dawn. The surprise was total. The Amorite armies were thrown into confusion as Israel struck them with relentless force. But the battle did not end there. God himself fought for his people. As the Amorites fled, hailstones rained down from heaven, killing more than the sword. In the midst of the chaos, Joshua lifted his voice in prayer before the entire nation. Sun, stand still over Gibeon, and moon, over the valley of Ajalon. And God answered. The sun halted in the sky. The day stretched beyond its natural limit. And Israel pressed the fight until the victory was complete. Never before, and never again, was there a day quite like it, a day when the Lord listened to the voice of a man and fought so directly for his people. It was a cosmic sign that the conquest of the land was not by Israel's strength, but by the hand of God himself. Division of the land with the great battles won, and the strongest enemies subdued. Joshua's task turned from war to inheritance. The time had come for Israel to settle in the land promised to their forefathers. Under God's guidance, Joshua and the elders began the careful work of dividing the land among the 12 tribes of Israel. Judah received the wide and fertile lands of the south, stretching toward the desert and the Dead Sea. Ephraim and half the tribe of Manasseh were granted the central hill country, rich with valleys and fortified cities. To the north, the remaining tribes were assigned territories of fertile plains, mountains, and coastal lands, each portion marked according to God's will. East of the Jordan, Reuben, Gad, and the other half of Manasseh settled the lands already conquered by Moses, lands of pasture and open space. One tribe, however, received no territory of their own. The Levites, chosen by God to serve as priests, were scattered among the people. Instead of land, they were given 48 cities across Israel, including 6 cities of refuge, places of mercy and safety. In these cities, anyone accused of manslaughter could flee, finding protection until a fair trial could be held. This careful division was not only practical, but spiritual. It reminded Israel that the land was not theirs by conquest alone, but by covenant promise. Every stone boundary, every pasture and vineyard, was a living testimony that God had kept his word to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. For the first time, the people of Israel rested in the land as a nation, each tribe with a place to call home. United under God's promise, Joshua's final words, when the land had rest from war and each tribe had received its inheritance, Joshua gathered all Israel at Shechem, a place heavy with history. It was there that Abraham first built an altar when God promised the land to his descendants. It was there Jacob had buried the foreign idols beneath the oak tree. And now it became the place where Joshua called the people to remember. He stood before the elders, the leaders, the judges, and all the tribes, and his voice carried across the assembly, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I brought you out of Egypt. I struck down Pharaoh and his armies. I led you through the wilderness. I gave you this land, flowing with milk and honey. Not by your sword or your bow did you win it, but by my hand." Then Joshua pressed them with a choice: fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and truth. Put away the false gods your ancestors served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. Choose this day whom you will serve. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. The people responded with one voice, "We too will serve the Lord, for he is our God." And so they renewed the covenant, pledging their loyalty not to Joshua, nor to their own strength, but to the God who had delivered them. Joshua set up a great stone under the oak tree at Shechem, declaring it a witness to their promise. After many years of faithful leadership, Joshua's time came to an end. At 110 years old, the servant of the Lord was laid to rest in the land of Ephraim, and the inheritance he had helped to secure. His burial was not only the closing of a life, but the closing of an era. Israel had been transformed. Once a wandering nation of slaves, they were now a settled people, rooted in the promises given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Joshua's legacy was one of courage and obedience. He had been the young warrior who stood beside Moses, the spy who believed in God's promise when others doubted, and the leader who saw the Jordan part, Jericho fall, and the sun stand still. More than victories in battle, he left Israel with a covenant renewed, a reminder that their future rested not on walls of stone or strength of arms, but on faithfulness to the Lord their God. The period of the Judges. After Joshua's death, Israel entered a new era, the time of the Judges. The people now lived in the land of Canaan, but unlike before, they had no single king or central leader. Instead, they were bound together by their covenant with God and by the leaders he occasionally raised up to deliver them. This was an age marked not by steady faithfulness, but by a repeating cycle that revealed both human weakness and divine mercy. Time and again, the people of Israel would forget the Lord their God. They turned aside to the idols and false gods of the nations around them, bowing before carved images instead of the one who had delivered them. When they fell into idolatry, God removed his hand of protection, and their enemies would rise against the Midianites, Philistines, and others, crushing them with oppression. In their suffering, the Israelites would cry out to God for help, and in his compassion, he raised up judges, leaders chosen by him, filled with wisdom, courage, or even supernatural strength. These judges delivered Israel from their enemies and restored the people to faith. Yet after each period of victory and peace, Israel would again drift into rebellion, and the cycle would repeat. One of the first great judges was Gideon. When the Midianites ravaged Israel, stealing their harvests and leaving the people in poverty, God called Gideon, though he doubted himself at first. With only a small band of men, armed with trumpets and torches instead of swords, Gideon led Israel to a miraculous victory, proving that deliverance came not by numbers but by the hand of God. Another judge was Deborah, the only woman among them. She was both a prophetess and a wise leader. Under her guidance, Israel defeated Jabin, the Canaanite king, and his commander Sisera. Deborah's courage and her song of triumph inspired the nation, and Israel enjoyed peace for 40 years. Perhaps the most famous judge was Samson. From birth, he was set apart as a Nazirite, and God gave him extraordinary strength. With his bare hands, he tore apart lions and struck down Philistine armies. Yet his life was marred by weakness, pride, and temptation. Still, even in his failures, God used him to bring great blows against the Philistines, humbling Israel's enemies and reminding the people of God's power. This cycle of sin, oppression, repentance, and deliverance continued for generations. Finally, the last and greatest judge, Samuel, rose. More than a judge, he was a prophet and a priest. Samuel called Israel back to God with power and truth, guiding them through one of the most critical transitions in their history. It was under Samuel that the people cried out for a king, longing for a leader like the nations around them. And so Samuel became the bridge from the time of the judges to the era of the monarchy. The period of the judges was not simply a time of conflict. It was a time of lessons. Through victories and failures, Israel learned that prosperity and peace came only through faithfulness to God. Though they often stumbled, the Lord never abandoned them. Whenever they cried out, he forgave and restored them, proving again and again that his mercy was greater than their weakness. Samuel, the last judge. The story of Samuel begins not with him, but with his mother, Hannah. She was a woman of deep sorrow, for she longed for a child but remained barren for many years. With a broken heart, she poured out her prayers to the Lord in the temple, vowing that if God granted her a son, she would dedicate him to his service for life. God heard her prayer. In due time, Hannah gave birth to a son and named him Samuel, meaning God has heard. True to her vow, once Samuel was old enough, Hannah brought him to the tabernacle at Shiloh, placing him under the care of the priest Eli so that he might grow up in the service of the Lord. As a boy, Samuel lived in the temple, serving faithfully. One night, while he slept, he heard his name called, Samuel, Samuel. Thinking it was Eli, he ran to the priest, but Eli had not called him. This happened 3 times, until Eli realized that it was the Lord speaking to the child. He instructed Samuel to respond, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." From that moment, God began to reveal his word to Samuel, and the boy grew into a prophet and leader whose wisdom was respected throughout Israel. As Samuel matured, he became both prophet and judge over Israel. He guided the people with fairness, teaching them to abandon idols and return to the worship of the one true God. Under his leadership, the nation experienced moments of revival and victory. Yet the people grew restless. They looked at the kingdoms around them and demanded a king of their own, wanting to be like the other nations. Samuel was grieved. He knew that God himself was Israel's true king. But when Samuel prayed, the Lord told him, "It is not you they have rejected, but me as their king. Warn them of what a king will demand, but give them what they ask." Samuel obeyed. By God's command, he anointed Saul, a man tall and striking in appearance, to be the first king of Israel. At first, Saul was humble and seemed to follow God's will. But in time, pride hardened his heart. He began to act according to his own desires, disregarding God's commands. Because of Saul's disobedience, God told Samuel that another king would be chosen, a man after God's own heart. In secret, Samuel was sent to the house of Jesse in Bethlehem. There, God revealed to him a shepherd boy named David. Samuel anointed him with oil, marking him as the future king of Israel, though David's story would unfold later. This moment set the stage for a new chapter in Israel's history. Until his final days, Samuel continued to serve as prophet, judge, and intercessor for the people. He was the last of the judges and the bridge between 2 eras, the age of the judges and the age of the kings. When Samuel died, all Israel mourned him, remembering him as a man of justice, wisdom, and faithfulness. He was the child God had given in answer to a mother's prayer, and the leader who had guided a nation through one of its most pivotal transitions. Saul, Israel's first king. When the people of Israel demanded a king, God chose Saul to be their first. At first glance, he seemed perfect for the role, tall, strong, and handsome. He looked every bit the leader the people desired. When the prophet Samuel anointed him, hope and excitement spread throughout the nation. Finally, Israel had a king to lead them into battle and bring unity to the tribes. In the beginning, Saul showed humility and courage. With God's blessing, he won decisive victories over enemies such as the Ammonites and the Philistines. The people rejoiced, seeing in him a brave warrior and protector. Under Saul's leadership, Israel's enemies were driven back, and the nation began to feel strong and secure. But over time, Saul's heart began to change. Pride and impatience took root. One of his first grave mistakes came when he offered a sacrifice himself instead of waiting for Samuel, as God had commanded. Samuel rebuked him, declaring that God sought another man, one who would obey him fully. Still, Saul continued to reign, yet his disobedience grew deeper. When God commanded him to completely destroy the Amalekites and their possessions, Saul spared their king and kept the best of the livestock, claiming he intended them for sacrifice. Samuel confronted him, "To obey is better than sacrifice," and with those words, Saul learned that God had rejected him as king. Meanwhile, God chose David, a young shepherd with a pure heart, to be the future king. At first, Saul welcomed David into his court, even finding peace when David played the harp to calm his troubled spirit. But when David defeated the giant Goliath and the people praised him, Saul's admiration turned to jealousy. His envy grew into rage, and he sought to kill David. David, however, never raised his hand against Saul, even while fleeing through wilderness caves and deserts. David honored Saul as God's anointed king. This contrasts Saul's bitterness against David's loyalty, revealed the widening gap between the king Israel had and the king God desired. Saul continued to fight Israel's enemies, but his reign spiraled into chaos. Cut off from God's guidance, consumed by fear and envy, he became a shadow of the man he once was. The final blow came on Mount Gilboa, where the Philistines struck down his army. Saul's beloved son Jonathan fell in battle, and rather than be captured alive, Saul fell on his own sword. Thus ended the reign of Israel's first king, a reign that began with promise but ended in tragedy. Saul had every gift needed to be great: strength, courage, and the blessing of God, but his disobedience and jealousy led to his downfall. His life stands as a warning. Outward appearances may inspire confidence, but only a heart faithful to God can sustain true leadership. David, the shepherd who became king after the tragic fall of Saul. The people of Israel longed for no leadership. God had already chosen David, the young shepherd from Bethlehem, as the next king. And like Saul, who impressed with outward strength and stature, David was chosen for his heart. He was a man of faith, courage, and devotion to God. When the prophet Samuel first anointed David, he was still tending sheep, and known to the nation. Yet God saw in him a servant willing to trust and obey. That anointing set him apart, preparing him for a destiny that would shape Israel's future. David's courage was revealed most clearly in his famous encounter with the Philistine giant, Goliath. For 40 days, Goliath mocked Israel's army, challenging anyone to fight him. The soldiers trembled, and even King Saul stood powerless. When David visited the battlefield to deliver food to his brothers, he was shocked at Israel's fear. Filled with faith, he declared that the Lord would deliver Goliath into his hands. Refusing Saul's heavy armor, David went forward with only a sling, 5 smooth stones, and his trust in God. Facing the towering warrior, David proclaimed, "You come to me with sword and spear, but I come to you in the name of the Lord Almighty." He slung a stone that struck Goliath in the forehead, and the giant fell dead. This stunning victory made David a hero throughout Israel, though it also ignited Saul's envy. Though admired by the people, David's life became a constant struggle because of Saul's jealousy. Forced into exile, he fled through deserts and caves, pursued relentlessly by the king. Yet even when he had the chance to kill Saul, David refused, saying, "I will not lift my hand against the Lord's anointed." His patience and respect for God's authority showed the depth of his character. When Saul finally died in battle against the Philistines, David was anointed king of Judah, ruling from Hebron. After years of civil conflict, he was recognized as king over all Israel. David's reign united the tribes and brought strength to the kingdom. He captured the city of Jerusalem, making it his capital, and brought the Ark of the Covenant there, turning the city into the spiritual and political heart of Israel. His military campaigns expanded the borders of the nation, and his leadership ushered in a period of prosperity and stability. David was not only a warrior and king but also a poet. His psalms still resound as some of the most beautiful expressions of prayer, worship, and repentance ever written. Yet even this great king was not without sin. His darkest moment came when he desired Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah, one of his soldiers. David arranged for Uriah's death in battle so that he could take Bathsheba as his own. This act displeased the Lord, and though David repented with deep sorrow, the consequences brought pain to his household and kingdom. Still, what set David apart was not perfection, but his repentant heart. Whenever he fell, he turned back to God, seeking forgiveness and mercy. David reigned for 40 years, guiding Israel into what would be remembered as its golden age. On his deathbed, he passed the throne to his son Solomon, who would build the great temple in Jerusalem. David's life, filled with triumphs and failures, courage and weakness, remains a testimony to the power of faith and the grace of God. His story reminds us that God does not choose by outward appearance but by the heart, and that true greatness comes from humility, obedience, and trust in the Lord. Solomon, the king of wisdom and glory. When David, the great king of Israel, died, his son Solomon ascended the throne. Though young and inexperienced, Solomon understood the weight of ruling a vast and growing nation. One night, God appeared to him in a dream and offered, "Ask for whatever you wish, and I will give it to you." Solomon could have asked for power, wealth, or victory over his enemies. Instead, he humbly requested wisdom to discern justice and govern God's people faithfully. God was pleased. He granted Solomon not only wisdom greater than any man before him, but also riches, honor, and the promise of long life if he remained faithful. The fame of Solomon's wisdom spread across the known world. Leaders and travelers from distant nations came to hear his words and witness the prosperity of Israel under his reign. His most famous judgment involved two women who both claimed to be the mother of a child. Solomon proposed to divide the child in two, giving half to each. The true mother immediately cried out, preferring to lose her claim rather than see the child harmed. With this, Solomon revealed her identity, and the people marveled at his insight. Among Solomon's greatest achievements was the construction of the temple in Jerusalem, a dream his father David had held but was not permitted to fulfill. Solomon undertook the project with unmatched dedication. He formed an alliance with Hiram, king of Tyre, who supplied cedar and cypress wood. Tens of thousands of workers labored for 7 years, guided by the finest architects and craftsmen. The temple was magnificent. Its walls were lined with pure gold, its doors carved with cherubim and palm trees, and its inner sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, housed the Ark of the Covenant. When the temple was completed, Solomon gathered all Israel for its dedication. He prayed a long and moving prayer, asking God to hear the cries of his people whenever they turned toward this house of worship. As he prayed, the glory of the Lord filled the temple in a cloud, and the people bowed in awe. Solomon's rule brought peace and wealth to Israel. Trade flourished, alliances were secured, and Jerusalem became a shining center of culture and learning. Solomon himself composed proverbs, songs, and writings that reflected his wisdom and devotion to God. The Queen of Sheba traveled from afar to test him with difficult questions, and she left astonished at his knowledge, wealth, and the splendor of his court. Yet, for all his greatness, Solomon was not without weakness. He took many wives from surrounding nations, alliances that introduced foreign gods into Israel. Over time, his heart turned from complete devotion to the Lord, and he tolerated idol worship within his kingdom. God warned Solomon that this disobedience would have consequences, though he would not strip the kingdom away in Solomon's lifetime. The kingdom would be divided after his death. Solomon ruled Israel for 40 years. His reign was remembered as a time of peace, wealth, and divine blessing, but also as a cautionary tale of how even the wisest of men can falter when their hearts wander from God. After his death, his son Rehoboam inherited the throne, and just as God had spoken, the kingdom was torn in two. Yet Solomon's name endures as a symbol of wisdom and majesty. His temple became the spiritual center of Israel for generations, a place where heaven and earth seemed to meet. His story reminds us that wisdom is the greatest treasure, but true wisdom begins and ends with faithfulness to God. The Queen of Sheba and the division of the kingdom far to the south, and the land of Sheba rich with spices, gold, and precious stones. There reigned a wise and inquisitive queen. Word of Solomon's unmatched wisdom and wealth had reached her court. Curious and determined to see for herself, she prepared a magnificent caravan. Camels loaded with treasures, gold, gems, and rare spices accompanied her on the long journey north to Jerusalem. When the queen arrived, Solomon welcomed her with royal honor. She was astonished by the grandeur of his palace, walls covered in carvings, chambers adorned with gold, and servants clothed in splendor. Yet more than wealth, it was Solomon's wisdom that impressed her most. The queen tested him with difficult questions about life, justice, creation, and the mysteries of the world. To her amazement, Solomon answered them all with clarity and depth. She observed how he judged disputes fairly, managed resources wisely, and cared for his people with discernment. In awe, she confessed, What I heard in my own land was true, but the half was not told me. Your wisdom and prosperity surpass the report I heard. Blessed are your people who stand continually before you and hear your wisdom. She presented her gifts, and in return Solomon lavished her with treasures of his own. The queen of Sheba returned home not only with riches but with lessons in leadership and wisdom that became legendary across generations. Yet, even as his fame spread, shadows grew over Solomon's reign. The vast building projects, including his magnificent palace and the temple, demanded heavy taxes and forced labor. The people began to groan under the burden. Worse still, Solomon's many foreign wives brought their gods into Israel, and his heart turned from full devotion to the Lord. God warned him that the kingdom would be torn apart after his death. When Solomon died after 40 years of rule, his son Rehoboam became king. The people approached him with a plea, "Lighten the heavy burden your father placed on us, and we will serve you." Rehoboam sought advice. The elders counseled mercy and kindness, urging him to win the people's hearts. But his young companions told him to prove his strength by answering harshly, rejecting the wisdom of the elders. Rehoboam declared, "My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions." The words fell like fire among the people. 10 northern tribes refused to follow him. They proclaimed Jeroboam, once a servant of Solomon who had fled to Egypt, as their king. Thus the great kingdom, built by David and Solomon, was split in two: the northern kingdom of Israel with its capital in Samaria, and the southern kingdom of Judah with Jerusalem as its center. Fearing that his people might return to Jerusalem to worship at the temple, Jeroboam set up golden calves in Bethel and Dan, declaring, "Here are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up from Egypt." This sin led the northern kingdom into idolatry, a path that would bring sorrow and judgment. From that time forward, Israel and Judah lived as divided nations, often at war with one another. The unity and glory of Solomon's reign gave way to conflict, weakness, and vulnerability before foreign powers. The story of the Queen of Sheba shows how wisdom draws nations together, but the division under Rehoboam reveals how pride and folly tear them apart. What David and Solomon had built with courage and wisdom was broken by arrogance and disobedience. It was a lesson Israel would carry for generations. True strength lies not in riches, armies, or power, but in humility, justice, and faithfulness to God. Prophets in a divided kingdom. After Solomon's death, the once united kingdom of Israel was torn in two: the northern kingdom, Israel, and the southern kingdom, Judah. From that moment, their histories became marked by cycles of faithfulness and rebellion, of kings who turned toward God and kings who rejected him. Jeroboam, the first king of the northern kingdom, established golden calves in Bethel and Dan to prevent his people from journeying to the temple in Jerusalem. What he thought was a political strategy became a spiritual disaster. Idolatry took root, and each king after him followed the same path, leading Israel further away from the covenant. Among these rulers, none was more infamous than King Ahab. He married Jezebel, daughter of the king of Sidon, and together they spread the worship of Baal throughout Israel. Jezebel, ruthless and cunning, persecuted the prophets of the Lord, seeking to silence his voice. But God raised up a man who could not be silenced. Elijah stood boldly against Ahab and Jezebel, proclaiming that the Lord alone was God. At Mount Carmel, he issued a challenge to the prophets of Baal: "Let each prepare a sacrifice, and whichever God answered with fire would be the true God." From morning to evening, the prophets of Baal cried out, but no fire came. Then Elijah prayed, and the Lord sent fire from heaven. It consumed not only the sacrifice but the wood, the stones, and even the water poured around the altar. The people fell to the ground, crying, "The Lord, He is God." Yet the revival was brief, and Elijah's struggle continued. He prophesied drought and later rain, raised the dead son of a widow, and confronted kings with words of truth. But when the time came, God took Elijah up to heaven in a whirlwind, carried by a chariot of fire. Elijah's mantle fell upon his disciple, Elisha, who carried on his mission with miracles and compassion. He purified poisoned water in Jericho, multiplied oil for a widow so she could repay her debts, and even raised a child from the dead. Foreigners, too, witnessed God's power through him. Naaman, a Syrian commander, was cleansed of leprosy after obeying Elisha's simple command to wash in the Jordan River 7 times. Through Elisha, God revealed that his mercy was not bound by borders. His love extended even to outsiders who humbled themselves in faith. In the southern kingdom of Judah, the story was different. Though many kings strayed, some remained faithful and led reforms. King Hezekiah destroyed idols and restored worship in the temple. He prayed for deliverance when the mighty Assyrian army surrounded Jerusalem, and God sent an angel who struck down thousands in a single night. Later, when Hezekiah lay deathly ill, God heard his prayer and added 15 years to his life. Another great reformer was King Josiah. When the book of the law was discovered in the temple, Josiah was shaken to his core. Realizing how far the people had drifted, he tore down idols, cleansed the land, and renewed the covenant. Under his reign, the people celebrated Passover as they had not done since the days of the judges. Yet Judah also had kings like Manasseh, whose wickedness led the people into greater sin than the nations around them. He even sacrificed his own son in fire to false gods. Such sin sealed Judah's fate, for God's patience, though great, is not without end. In time, both kingdoms fell. The Assyrians conquered Israel, scattering its people. Later, Babylon invaded Judah, destroyed Jerusalem, and reduced Solomon's temple to ashes. Exile and sorrow came upon God's chosen nation, just as the prophets had warned. Yet even in judgment, God's voice never ceased. Prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Amos, and Hosea called the people to repentance, spoke of justice and mercy, and gave hope of restoration. They reminded Israel that though kingdoms rise and fall, God's promises endure. A future awaited a Messiah, a Redeemer, who would bring salvation not only to Israel but to all nations. The Babylonian exile. The kingdom of Judah stood on fragile ground. Under King Jehoiakim, the nation faced constant pressure from the rising power of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, marched against Jerusalem, and Judah's attempts at resistance only brought harsher consequences. In 597 BC, Nebuchadnezzar besieged the city, carried away King Jehoiakim, nobles, craftsmen, and treasures from the temple of the Lord. Though a new king, Jehoiachin, was placed on the throne, his reign lasted only months before Babylon struck again. Jehoiachin, too, was taken captive, and the people of Jerusalem saw their hope fading. Nebuchadnezzar then installed Zedekiah as a vassal king. But Zedekiah, swayed by pride and false promises of freedom, rebelled against Babylon. His defiance sealed Judah's fate. In 588 BC, Babylon returned with fury. For nearly 2 years, Jerusalem endured a crushing siege. Hunger and disease spread through the city. Mothers wept for their starving children, and the once proud walls of David's city stood battered and weak. At last, in 586 BC, the Babylonian army broke through. The Temple of Solomon, the heart of Jewish worship, was burned and reduced to rubble. Its golden vessels were plundered, its holy courts desecrated. Palaces and homes fell into ashes, and the great walls of Jerusalem were torn down stone by stone. King Zedekiah attempted to flee by night, but he was captured on the plains of Jericho. In a brutal act meant to crush the nation's spirit, Nebuchadnezzar ordered Zedekiah's sons killed before his eyes, and then blinded him. Shackled, he was led in chains to Babylon, a broken symbol of Judah's downfall. Those who survived were taken into captivity. Families were uprooted and carried hundreds of miles away to Babylon. There, in a land of foreign gods and customs, the people of Judah were forced to rebuild their lives. For 70 years they lived as exiles, merchants, laborers, and servants in a strange land. Yet even in exile, they clung to their faith. The words of the prophets became their lifeline. Jeremiah had foretold this judgment but also promised that after 70 years, God would bring them home. Ezekiel, among the captives, spoke visions of restoration, of dry bones rising to life, and of a new heart and spirit God would give his people. The exile was not only a punishment but a season of refining. Israel learned, in foreign soil and sorrow, that no temple walls could contain God's presence, and no distance could separate them from his covenant love. Though their city lay in ruins and their temple burned, hope remained. God had not abandoned his people. Through suffering, he was shaping them for renewal. The exile would end, the prophets assured, and the people would one day return to Jerusalem to rebuild what was lost. The Babylonian captivity stands as both a warning and a promise that turning from God leads to ruin, but his mercy always provides a path home. Prophets in exile. The Babylonian exile was a turning point in the history of Israel. Torn from their land, their temple reduced to ashes, and their leaders carried away in chains, the people faced the greatest test of their faith. Strangers in a foreign land, surrounded by idols and powerful kings, they wondered, had God abandoned them? Yet even in captivity, the Lord raised up prophets to remind his people that his covenant still stood, that judgment was not the end, and that hope would one day return. Jeremiah remained in the land of Judah when many were carried away. Known as the weeping prophet, he had long warned of Jerusalem's fall, pleading with kings and people to turn back to God. When the destruction came, his heart broke with the city's ruins. Still, Jeremiah wrote letters to the exiles, urging them not to despair. He told them to build houses and live in them, plant gardens and eat their fruit. Seek the peace of the city where I have carried you, for in its peace you will find your peace. He assured them that exile was part of God's plan, lasting 70 years, but that afterward God would bring them home. His words, grief mixed with promise, gave the people courage to endure. Among the captives in Babylon was Ezekiel, a priest turned prophet. His visions were dramatic, filled with symbols of God's glory and power. He saw the heavens opened and a chariot of fire with living creatures carrying the throne of God. Even in a foreign land, God's presence was with his people. One of Ezekiel's most famous visions was of a valley filled with dry bones. At God's command, the bones came together, flesh and breath entered them, and they rose as a living army. This vision declared that Israel, though seemingly dead, would one day be restored by the Spirit of God. Ezekiel also promised a new covenant, in which God would give his people a new heart and a new spirit. Daniel was a young man when he was taken to Babylon, chosen to serve in the king's court because of his wisdom and learning. Though surrounded by temptation and pressure to conform, Daniel remained faithful to the God of Israel. He refused to eat the king's food, remaining true to the dietary laws of his people. And God blessed him with strength and wisdom greater than all others. He interpreted dreams for King Nebuchadnezzar, revealing the rise and fall of empires, showing that human kingdoms would pass away, but God's kingdom would stand forever. When Allah forbade prayer to anyone but the king, Daniel continued to pray to the Lord 3 times a day. For this, he was thrown into a den of lions, but God sent his angel to shut the lions' mouths. Daniel emerged unharmed, a living testimony that the Lord protects those who trust him. Through Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel, God reminded his people that exile was not abandonment but correction, a refining fire to bring them back to faith. These prophets called Israel to repentance, but also held out the promise of restoration, that one day the exiles would return, rebuild Jerusalem, and see God's covenant renewed. The exile became a time of sorrow but also of deep reflection. Cut off from the temple, the people learned that God's presence was not limited to walls of stone. He was with them in Babylon as much as in Jerusalem. And the words of the prophets gave them hope that out of ruin would come renewal, and out of ashes new life. The return from exile of 70 years had passed since the people of Judah were carried away into Babylon. They had lived as strangers in a foreign land, their temple in ruins, their songs of worship muted by sorrow. Yet the promises of God remained alive in their hearts. Through the prophets, they had heard his word, "I will bring you back to the land I swore to your fathers." In 539 BC, the great Persian king Cyrus conquered Babylon. And like many rulers of his age, Cyrus was known for his wisdom and mercy. He believed that peoples should honor their own gods and live in their ancestral lands. In 538 BC, he issued a royal decree. The exiled Israelites were free to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple of the Lord. This decree was more than a political act, it was the fulfillment of prophecy. Centuries earlier, the prophet Isaiah had spoken of Cyrus by name, calling him God's chosen instrument to deliver his people. Now that prophecy was reality, with joy and trembling, the exiles prepared to leave. Not all chose to return. Many had built lives in Babylon, but tens of thousands gathered their families and belongings, ready to endure the long journey back to their homeland. They carried with them not only their possessions but also sacred treasures that Nebuchadnezzar had once taken from the temple. Cyrus returned these items, a sign that the God of Israel's worship would be restored. The road back to Jerusalem was difficult, stretching across deserts and mountains. Yet every step was filled with hope. The land of their ancestors, once lost, was calling them home. When the people arrived, they found Jerusalem still in ruins. The temple, the dwelling place of God's presence, lay as a heap of broken stones. Under the leadership of Zerubbabel, a descendant of King David, and Joshua the high priest, they began to rebuild. The work was slow, resisted by enemies around them, and burdened by poverty. At times, discouragement nearly halted their efforts, but the prophets Haggai and Zechariah rose to inspire the people. They proclaimed that the Lord was with them, and that his Spirit would make the work prosper. "Not by might, nor by power, but by my Spirit," declared the Lord. Strengthened by these words, the people pressed on. At last, the foundation of the new temple was laid. When the priests blew their trumpets and the Levites sang songs of praise, the people wept aloud. Some cried tears of joy, seeing God's promise fulfilled. Others, remembering the glory of Solomon's temple, wept with sorrow at its more humble form. Yet all rejoiced, for the house of the Lord was rising once more. The return from exile was not merely a physical journey, it was a spiritual rebirth. Israel had learned in Babylon that God was not confined to a building or a city. Now, back in their land, they dedicated themselves anew to his covenant. Though hardships remained, the return marked the beginning of a new chapter. The people had seen judgment, exile, and despair, yet they had also seen God's faithfulness. The story of their restoration testified to a truth that would echo through generations. Even in ruin, God brings renewal. Even in exile, he prepares the way home. The restoration of Jerusalem. The first group of exiles returned under the leadership of Zerubbabel, a descendant of King David, and Joshua the high priest. What they found was heartbreaking. Jerusalem lay in ruins, its walls broken down, its temple, once the glory of Solomon, reduced to ashes. Yet their faith in God gave them courage. With determination, they began to rebuild the altar of the Lord, offering sacrifices even before the temple was restored. Soon, they laid the foundation of the new temple. When the priests sounded their trumpets and the people shouted with joy, the air filled with both celebration and sorrow. The younger rejoiced, while the elders, who remembered Solomon's temple, wept aloud. Together, their voices created a chorus of hope and grief. Though enemies from surrounding nations opposed their work and sought to discourage them, the people pressed on. Prophets Haggai and Zechariah encouraged them, declaring that God's Spirit was with them. After years of struggle, the temple was completed, a powerful sign that God's presence had not abandoned his people. Years later, Ezra the scribe and priest arrived in Jerusalem with another wave of returnees. He carried with him the sacred scrolls of the law. Ezra's mission was not only to strengthen the temple but to restore the spiritual life of the people. He gathered the nation and read aloud the words of the law from morning until midday. Men, women, and children listened with tears in their eyes as they realized how far they had strayed from God's commandments. Ezra led them in confession, repentance, and a renewed covenant to follow the Lord with all their hearts. His work re-established worship, restored the feasts, and renewed the people's dedication to holiness. But the city itself still lay exposed, its broken walls leaving the people vulnerable to enemies. Nehemiah, a cupbearer to King Artaxerxes of Persia, heard of the suffering of his people and wept. With courage, he asked the king for permission to return and rebuild Jerusalem's defenses. The king not only agreed but also provided supplies and letters of protection. Arriving in Jerusalem, Nehemiah surveyed the ruined walls by night. He rallied the people, saying, "Let us rise up and build." Despite mockery, threats, and open opposition from surrounding nations, the people worked with trowel in one hand and sword in the other. Families labored side by side, each repairing the section nearest their homes. By God's grace and the people's perseverance, the walls were rebuilt in just 52 days, a miracle of unity and faith. With the walls restored, the people could live in safety once again. Nehemiah, like Ezra, also instituted reforms. He fought against corruption, defended the poor, restored the keeping of the Sabbath, and called the people back to God's covenant. Together, Ezra and Nehemiah led a spiritual revival. The law was read publicly. The people confessed their sins, and they renewed their vow to serve the Lord faithfully. The restoration of the temple and the rebuilding of the walls marked not only a physical renewal but a spiritual rebirth. Once a people broken and scattered, the Israelites now stood again in their land, worshiping the Lord, united in hope. Jerusalem was no longer a heap of ruins but once more the heart of God's people. The stories of the Old Testament are more than echoes from a distant past. They are living reminders of faith, failure, and unfailing mercy of God. From creation to covenant, from exile to restoration, they reveal the unbroken thread of His purpose. Weaving hope into the fabric of human history, these men and women, Abraham, Moses, Deborah, David, and countless others, were not perfect. They stumbled, doubted, and sometimes fell. Yet through them, God's plan moved forward, preparing the world for what was yet to come. Their struggles are our struggles. Their questions are our questions. And their faith, though tested, points us to the same God who is faithful still. As we leave the pages of these ancient stories, may their lessons remain alive in us. May we too choose faith over fear, obedience over pride, and hope over despair. For the God of Israel, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is the God who still calls, redeems, and restores today. These are not just the stories of yesterday. They are the timeless stories of us all.